Good morning. My name is Anta Cisse-Green. I serve as the General Counsel and Senior Vice Chancellor for Legal Affairs here at SUNY, and I use she and her pronouns. On behalf of Governor Cuomo, the SUNY Board of Trustees and its chairman, Dr. Merrill Tisch, our Chancellor, Dr. Jim Malatras, and my colleagues on the SUNY System Executive Leadership Team, I am pleased to welcome you as we begin the fourth SUNY Spectrum Conference. First, I'd like to take this time to thank the leaders of the Spectrum Conference for their tireless work in making this conference possible, particularly our presidential co-chairs, Presidents Laliberte, Esterberg, Terenzio, Young, and Crabill. Special thanks also to Elizabeth Brady, our Director of Sexual and Interpersonal Violence Prevention, and also Spectrum Principal Investigator Joseph Storch. The fact that we have drawn 1,921 attendees from across the US and Canada shows the deep importance of this issue. And we are grateful for the work that you are all doing as together we partner to create a world free from violence against members of the LGBTQIA+ community. The Office of General Counsel is proud to support Spectrum and the innovative legal and policy thinking that has emanated from this conference. The work that is done aiding our students and community members across the country. While Spectrum is not aimed at learning about the law, there is plenty of news in that regard. Spectrum is about going beyond the law. It's about what is best practice, what is right, and what we can do together to help our students and community members. This year has certainly been an interesting one for legal developments affecting the LGBTQIA+ community. It's been a year of significant change, of steps backwards, but fortunately of steps forward. And just this morning, the Supreme Court affirmed the lower court case of a transgender student's use of a bathroom that corresponded to his gender identity. He challenged the local school board's decision to require him to use either a unisex bathroom or one that corresponded to the sex that he was assigned at birth. This is another step forward. This conference is important to this university and to each of us. The work continues, and we are proud to have you all as sponsors to help us keep moving forward. I send you my warmest wishes of welcome, and am now pleased to introduce Spectrum Principal Investigator and SUNY Associate Counsel, Joseph Storch.
Thank you, Anta, and thank you everyone for joining us for this 4th annual Spectrum Conference. We are so privileged to be here and so privileged to be here with you even during this challenging time. I'm Joe Storch. I serve as an associate counsel at SUNY and get to work on incredible programs like this Spectrum Conference. I use he and him, and I'm so glad to welcome you. I want to start by thanking our partner sponsors. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and nothing can happen without the work of many, many people. So we start by thanking the State University of New York and the Office of Victim Services, our primary hosts and sponsors. We want to thank the SUNY Student Conduct Institute, NASPA's Culture of Respect, the Issue Voter Campaign, some great higher ed associations, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, the American Council on Education, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, and the American Association of Community Colleges. We want to thank our coalition partners in New York, NYSCASA and NYSCADIV. We want to thank our higher education partners, the City University of New York, the Council of Independent Colleges and Universities, the Association of Proprietary Colleges, and the CEI at the University of Rochester. We want to thank the One Love Foundation and the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. We want to thank our great SUNY partners, the SUNY Press. We want to thank the SUNY Pride program, as well as the SUNY Online program. We want to thank national groups, the LGBTQ+ presidents. We want to thank the University of Vermont Legal Issues Conference, NASPA Region 2, and mostly, we want to thank all of you. In the criminal justice system, sexually based offenses are considered especially heinous. In New York City, the dedicated detectives who investigate these vicious felonies are members of an elite squad known as the Special Victims Unit. One of those dedicated detectives is Jamie Gray-Hyder. She is filming today, but she had an incredible message of support for our Spectrum Conference, and we will welcome her to give that message to all of you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Gray-Hyder. I use she and her pronouns, and I am delighted to be joining you for the 4th annual SUNY Spectrum Conference. I know what you're all thinking, and yes, I am one of the dedicated detectives who investigates especially heinous crimes on Law and Order SVU. But more importantly, I am proud to serve as an activist for equality. Now, equality starts with representation. It's 2021, and my character, Kat, is celebrated as the first openly LGBTQIA+ detective in a series that has been on the air for decades. For too long, characters representing our community have been few and far between, and when present on popular shows, in movies, and in the media, we're often subject to stereotypes and marginalization, which does more harm than good. On SVU, I am proud to represent a well-rounded character who also happens to be bisexual. It's a part of who Kat is, but doesn't define her entire being, which was very important to the writers and myself, as we did not want to tokenize her. And even as we celebrate these small victories in representation, we must reconcile with how far we have to go. Many of you come from communities where the leaders are considering the rights of their LGBTQIA+ members and trying to protect them. But unfortunately, many of you come from places where those rights are under attack as we speak. There are laws, law enforcement individuals, and politicians actively working to harm and alienate the rights of this community, which especially impacts our Black, brown, and trans members. The sad truth is that racism, homophobia, and transphobia does exist in certain quarters where it's being protected, and one bisexual TV detective isn't going to change that. But that's where you all come in. And I know you don't need to hear it from me, but all of you here at the SUNY Spectrum Conference have your work cut out for you. The challenges and harmful threats faced by our LGBTQIA community are many, but we cannot remain silent in the face of oppression. We cannot remain silent in the face of racism and homophobia. We cannot remain silent while the lives of any of our LGBTQIA+ or Black or brown neighbors are at risk. So what can we do? Well, we can amplify our voices. We can strengthen our resolve. We can use forums such as the Spectrum Conference as a way to organize, make connections, and continue our education. And we don't have to do any of it alone. We have willing and able allies all around us, including the thousands of fellow attendees here today. We have allies in the inspirational speakers that you will hear from throughout the conference, and I encourage you to follow up with them, read their books, and invite them to future discussions in your community. I also want to remind you that there are important allies in unexpected places. There are folks in law enforcement and in government who want to engage with and be educated by the LGBTQIA+ community in order to break down barriers, foster safety, and build trust. We must foster these complicated but necessary connections in our communities in order to see lasting change. Now, I want to thank Chancellor Jim Malatras, the conference presidential co-chairs, and Spectrum leadership Elizabeth Brady and Joe Storch for this invitation. I am so grateful to them for having me, and I am honored to play a part in this critical conversation on one of the leading civil rights issues of our time. Let Spectrum be the start of the conversation. Then take the knowledge, resources, and practical solutions discussed here and work to implement them in your community. We must continue to fight until every community, campus, workplace, and home environment are safe spaces for the LGBTQIA community and our Black and brown neighbors. Thank you so much. I'm sending love to you all.
As a longtime fan of Law and Order SVU, I can't even. We are going to hear in a few minutes from our Chancellor, Dr. Jim Malatras. Dr. Malatras, the 14th Chancellor of the State University of New York, is someone who is an incredible friend to this work. He is deeply committed to our students and to their success, to their health, to their safety. His agenda is one student-focused program after another student-focused program, and we are so privileged to have him. I want to note he has been a steady supporter of our work to reduce the impact of sexual and interpersonal violence. He's been a supporter of the Spectrum Conference and SUNY's Got Your Back, hosting one of our major events in New York City. I guess it was 2 years ago now at this point. He's been a supporter of the Student Conduct Institute and SUNY's Got Your Back, going back to his work in the governor's office on Education Law 129B. And in the middle of COVID and an economic disaster, when no one would have said boo if he had put this aside, instead he stood up the Center for Advanced Research in Reducing the Impact of Violence in Education, because he prioritized this even in a global pandemic and a national maelstrom. And we are so grateful to have him here. But I get the privilege of introducing our next speaker, Elizabeth Brady. It was less than 5 years ago that we started working on an idea, the idea of a conference that would solely address sexual and interpersonal violence and harassment against members of the LGBTQIA+ community. And no one thought it could be done. Frankly, a few thought it should be done. So many people said to us, if this is such an important issue, why isn't somebody already doing it? In fact, Elizabeth and I went to a meeting with folks from other state agencies and organizations, and with the exception of Elizabeth Cronin from the Office of Victim Services, because of course, with the exception of Elizabeth, nobody else thought we could actually pull off this conference. One person said we should host it in a local casino because at least people would have something to do. They could go and gamble. And Elizabeth never took no for an answer. It's not nothing to create a national conference out of nothing, out of thin air. It's not nothing to fund it and budget it and advertise it when it hasn't been done before. And 620, and many of you here came to visit us with us in Albany in that first year, and then 826. And then last year during COVID, when people could have said, I'm doing something else, 1,650. And this morning, we went over 5,000 registrations in the 4 years of SUNY Spectrum. Every single one of them, a person who stands up and says, I am committed to reducing violence against members of the LGBTQIA+ community. And although we are so grateful to be joined by experts and people who are really doing this work, I will tell you that for Elizabeth and me, what's been most special are the people who are not engaged at all, who come to Spectrum because somebody told them to do, their department chair told them to do so, somebody else told them to go. And they would come up to us at the end of these conferences and they would say, and I remember one conversation, the person said, I didn't even know this was a thing. I didn't even know this was really something to think about, but here are the things I'm going to do. And so somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, this fall, there'll be students who the door tags on their rooms will, instead of being pink and blue, they'll be in the college colors. And somewhere in the Midwest, there are going to be, there's an OBGYN who will set up a separate seating area to make sure that people who present as male are comfortable going to an OBGYN. And somewhere in the Southeast, there are college professors who will be attentive to the name that folks use, to the pronouns that folks use, because all of you have come to SUNY Spectrum, and we could not be more honored. Our next speaker has kept to the mission, has defined what the mission is for this. She's fought for this conference, for this topic, and together she and I know, hope for the day when this conference will be no longer necessary, where people will say, a conference to reduce violence against the LGBTQIA+ community, what an outmoded idea, what an unnecessary thing. But today is not that day. This year is not that year. Even during COVID, when folks could have pulled back, all of you are here, and our next speaker is stepping forward. If you look at the org chart, I'm supposed to be the one who's mentoring Elizabeth Brady, but on days like today, the shoe is firmly on the other foot. So with congratulations to her on another exceptional SUNY Spectrum conference, please join me in welcoming the Director of Sexual and Interpersonal Violence Prevention at the State University of New York, Elizabeth Brady. Elizabeth?
Thank you. I purposely turned off self-view, but I'm sure that I'd be as red as my dress right now. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Brady. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Director of Sexual and Interpersonal Violence Prevention here at SUNY. I wanted to pause and reflect on why we are all here today before we got started, beginning with going back to November 19th, 2020, the day before 2020's Transgender Day of Remembrance. The Human Rights Campaign released its annual report of recorded violent deaths of transgender and gender nonconforming people. 37 were recorded, a number that is likely undercounted, having made 2020 the most violent year on record since counting the numbers began in 2013. By the start of 2021, that number had gone up to 44. Today, on the 28th day of Pride Month, there are 29 recorded violent murders of trans and gender nonconforming folks in the US, more than twice the number reported on this day last year, the majority being trans women of color, most being Black trans women. Beyond the numbers, these are children, parents, business owners, advocates, activists, ballroom dancers, and humans. Most recently, on June 14th, E.J. Boykin, a college student, was murdered. We are obligated to honor the lives and remember the souls of those lost, to learn about the systems of inequality that allow for the disproportionate impact of violence against the LGBTQIA+ community, and to challenge those systems. Further, we must simultaneously focus on preventing violence and creating systems that enhance the lived experiences of LGBTQIA+ students and community members. We must support and offer support to them while they grieve. We must create systems and services that enable them to not just survive, but to thrive. Colleges and universities, microcosms of the world around us, are uniquely poised to do just this. As institutions of education, we can and must make critical changes that have ripple effects. We can shape the journalists of tomorrow who are on our campuses today so that they can go on to report responsibly on the epidemic of violence. But more, they can share with the public the lives of trans folks, increasing representation in mainstream media and centering their stories, showing their entire humanity beyond just stereotypes and caricatures. We can teach our future teachers to create inclusive classrooms, taking down barriers to education and replacing them with springboards to success. Future medical professionals can leave our campuses with the knowledge and competency to provide inclusive healthcare to trans and non-binary folks. Student services and student affairs professionals have the ability to create safe spaces in the here and now for LGBTQIA+ students, giving them the chance to use college as a time for self-discovery. Further, we have the chance to re-examine systems and policies on campus that can plant the seeds of change for the future. Over the course of the next week, we will hear from expert speakers who will share critical insight and knowledge. They will not have all the answers, and no one session will be the answer to solving any one problem. Instead, our hope for the week is that we use this time to listen and learn, and then reflect on the practical implications for our own campuses, organizations, and communities. Think critically about the lessons learned from others, reflect on who our campuses we can engage and partner with, use this week as our launching pads for a safer, stronger campus and safer, stronger communities where all students are afforded the opportunity to not just survive, but thrive. With that, I am pleased to welcome back Anta Green, General Counsel for the State University of New York. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I really appreciate it. So it is now my pleasure to introduce to you all our 14th Chancellor of the State University of New York, Dr. Jim Malatras.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Anta. I'm gonna just make a note about Joe Storch that he put me after a famous actor on Law and Order to follow, and then follow Elizabeth after that. So I feel like I'm already behind the 8 ball and trying to be as profound as others. I'll be brief because I think getting to the presidential panel, you have some really great presidents that are going to be discussing these issues today, and they are really phenomenal leaders, and I see them, most of them, on my Zoom squares. Hopefully it could be in person next year, because I think that experience is better than being in a Zoom environment. Elizabeth mentioned, I was at the Pride Parade yesterday in New York City, and we had many of our students from the SUNY community on the float, still COVID restrictions, but the enthusiasm and excitement and the energy was great. And it was a beautiful thing to be part of that moment. And I brought my children with me because it was important to show children that people are different in our society and it's okay. And love is love, and people gather together, and you have to celebrate and embrace that. But Elizabeth mentioned at the same time, 2020 had some of our highest numbers of violence against the community, especially the transgender community. The sad fact is that hate was normalized through our nation's highest office. And that's the truth. It's not a political statement. That's just a truthful statement. While leaders leave, right? Hopefully we're going back to a more open and inclusive federal government. There's still an undercurrent of people that exhibit great hate, resentment, and against many people in the community. Leaders only lead because they get the support of others, right? People in the highest office only get elected because they have that. So there's still this undercurrent here. And that's why SUNY, a state university system, is so important. And that's why I'm proud and honored to lead the largest system of higher education. First, we want to be the most inclusive system for everyone that comes to our doors. Part of our mission is to invite everyone in, make sure they have a good experience, make sure they have a welcomed experience. We have some work to do on our own campuses. And that's why conferences like this are important. This is why what Joe and Elizabeth and the team does is so important, to make sure everyone feels welcomed in the environment. But at the same time, SUNY, our students, our faculty, our staff, our leaders, like the presidents you're about to hear from, have a larger responsibility. It's not just creating a more inclusive university system. We have a larger mission to drive social change across society. And that is what this is about. It's not enough for us just to say, you can come to SUNY and be welcomed. What are we going to do with our experience, with our positions, to change society for the better, to make it a more inclusive society? And that's what a conference like this is all about, collectively gathering people from all across the nation to talk through these issues, and not just talk through these issues, to drive actual change. In the end, talking is fine, but where do we end up? And how do we make life better? I'm proud to be a New Yorker. I'm proud to be in government for a long time. I was on the floor for marriage equality in the state of New York, on the Senate floor. That was one of the best moments of our lives. But that's just one issue of many issues that we're dealing with. There's still many issues of violence and things that Elizabeth mentioned that we're going to have to overcome. So I'm proud to turn it over now from me, because I'm not the expert, to a bunch of presidents that we have who identify as members of this community, as well as the communities we represent among our students. And I have, my pleasure is to introduce our presidential panel, which is made up of 5 presidents and co-chairs of the Spectrum Conference. We have Dr. Casey Crabill from Onondaga Community College. I love Onondaga Community College. She is a great president. She has really driven a lot of change in Central New York. Think about that. How do you drive social justice and change in Central New York? We have Dr. Kristin Esterberg, who is leaving us, but we won't use that against her today. She is leaving the SUNY system, but she'll always be a member of the SUNY family. And she is in Potsdam. Again, lots of issues in the North Country. And think about that. How do you drive social change? How do you bring students in from different parts of the state with different backgrounds, from the LGBTQIA plus community, and make them feel welcomed in that community at SUNY and drive change as well? We have Dr. Michael Laliberte, who is the president of SUNY Delhi. Same type of thing, town gown issues. He's been driving lots of change on his campus as well. We have Marion Terenzio, whom I love, Cobleskill. She not only knows agriculture, she knows inclusivity, and she is one of our most dynamic presidents that we have in the system. I keep inviting myself back to her campus because she's doing such innovative things. Sometimes I think she has enough of me coming, but that's okay. She has to invite me because I'm the chancellor. And finally, we have Kris Young, who is the president of SUNY Orange. You have, and she has done a remarkable job, again, in Orange County in New York, a relatively conservative area of the state, often not inclusive. These presidents are not just helping their college community. They are representations of our community to help push social change, equality, in their communities writ large. That's a difficult task. They have a lot of responsibilities just being college presidents, but they have a larger responsibility, and they've been giving back in a meaningful way. So I'm honored to be part of this conference. I thank Joe and his entire team. I'd like to see everyone in person, hopefully next year. and I turn it over to my distinguished colleagues for their panel. Thank you. And I don't even know if I was supposed to introduce them, but I did anyway, because that's what the chancellor gets to do, Joe. So.
So thank you, Chancellor, and we will ask our presidents to unmute themselves and begin the panel. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
I've never heard such colleagues being so quiet. So
I know.
let me do the honors of starting. Thank you, Chancellor. It's always a pleasure to see you, be with you, and hear from you. And Elizabeth and Joe, thank you for your dedication. You are two individuals who live what you believe, and that is rare. And I do think, and I hope my fellow presidents would agree, is that that's what we're trying to do in this era. I know leadership requires, I think, expressed and learned experiences. For me, particularly for the Spectrum Conference, it's showing people that part of who you are is who you are. You cannot be afraid anymore to say things or put things out there. I think for me, the hardest, well, it's not even hard, but for me, what's been interesting is every time we say something now, the pushback and the vitriol continues. And for me, that means that I need to continue my work. The fear of whether it's the First Amendment or people thinking that they can throw whatever they can at you, that the fear of not saying is worse. And we need to continue the work we're doing. We need to live it. And we need to uphold what education should be. And it's critical thinking. It's critiquing what is not in the best interest of our students or our communities. So I'll just start there and hoping that my fellow presidents can add to the beginning of the conversation.
Well, I'll jump in, Marion. And I think one of the things that as presidents we've been talking about is how far we've come, but how far we have not yet come as well. I think you and I have been part of the Spectrum Conference since its start, as well as you, Michael, and others. And I think as we look back at the last 5 years, they have been among the most challenging that I can think of in terms of higher education. There's certainly been many, many gains, especially for lesbians and gays. But when I think about the status of transgender people and the real challenges that Elizabeth was talking about earlier in her remarks, there's still so much work we have to do on college campuses to ensure that that we are indeed being that welcoming, inclusive, and affirming campus community that we need to be. So I'm, as I think about how extraordinary it is that we're now entering or now having, year 5 of this conference, I'm also really struck by how much work there is still to come and how difficult the work has been over the last year, 2 years.
Kristin, I know that you reflected back on the past 5 years. I want to go back a little further and look at, the past 52 years. We're celebrating this year, our year of 52 years of pride across this country. And I really think that this year we need to focus a little bit more on our origins. One of the things that has come up quite a bit during this Pride season is people talking about the original Pride was a protest. And the fact that there are issues here that we're still facing. And we don't have the luxury of, I remember my first Pride, it was Boston Pride, and it was out on the Commons, and there were parades and celebrations and dances. And yes, we have room for that, but where was the protest? Where was the saying that we need change? And that's what we're all about today. I hope that we're going to not only just see change in terms of marriage equality, but also change in supporting our students, supporting our brothers and sisters of color who have been marginalized and abused by the system and by society, and how we can stand up for this. We can't sit back on our laurels and say, well, especially those of us in the, I would say, who have experience in the gay community, rather than we're older. We've had the luxury of the celebrations, but it's time again to protest. It's time again to stand up for what's right, and not just within the gay community, but all of folks who are being marginalized. We have a responsibility, and as leaders of our campuses, we take that responsibility very seriously, and we have to institute it every day, whether we're protecting our students of color, our LGBTQIA students, our trans students, our students who are poor or marginalized in some other ways. We need to make sure that we stand up and be part of it. And as much as I appreciate Pride, I also appreciate the fact that we have a lot of work to do, and that we need to come together and work on these issues.
So I'll add that it was really nice to start this morning with our keynote speaker talking about representation mattering. And I think that's really true. And yet here the five of us are all white, all cis. And I think, you know, that's illustrative of how far we still have to go. And thank you, Michael, for talking about early Pride. And really the courage of trans women of color who took on the things that challenged us then and continue to challenge us now. So I think representation does matter. And I'm happy to be here and to have this conversation, and so that we're pushing those boundaries and making sure that we really go beyond welcome to safe on our campus.
Yeah, thank you, Casey, for drawing that out. You know, just yesterday, I was, you know, on Twitter and marveling in such a short time frame. I'm on Twitter and I'm watching the Chancellor of my state university on a float in New York City, and drummers from my state university, and thinking, this was not my experience, and what I like to think was not so long ago as an undergraduate and the president of my institution in that time, and just reeling, knowing that I would be part of this panel, and reflecting on the relative power I have in my day job right now, and thinking, so I'm going to walk right back to a campus where I'm sitting right now, where, you know, even with brilliant legislation in the state of New York, empowering me in this privileged position to say, game over, everyone, where any restroom with one fixture shall be an all gender restroom. We're not even having this conversation anymore. We are doing this thing. Still having tension with really good people about, like, well, now I have to walk. Now I have to walk further to go to a restroom if I don't want to use that restroom, and having to say, yeah, but how do you think our students and colleagues have felt for the 71 years of our college existence prior to this moment? And so the contrasts right now are absolutely remarkable, particularly in June, when everyone seems to have a lot of rainbow in their logos.
Kris, you know, I'm so grateful for your bringing that up. I'm a parent of a genderqueer trans person, and the challenges that they face on a daily basis, trying to figure out where is it safe for them to be affirmed, where can they go, where can they use a restroom. I remember the first time we traveled, we were going from Maine back here to Potsdam, just after they had begun to identify as trans. And we couldn't find safe places for them to use the restroom. And so as we're thinking about, you know, the privilege that folks like us have, I've been really wondering, it's wonderful that gay people can marry, but what good is that to my child when their basic right to identity is not affirmed? And when I think about where we really have to go as campuses and as a movement, we really have to think about how are we protecting and ensuring that young trans people, especially young trans people of color, have basic rights to self-affirmation and identity, because you can see so very clearly the pain that young people feel just trying to live their basic authentic lives.
Kristen, to go back to what you and Kris had said about, Pride and the Rainbow Month of June. And if you can see my picture, you can see that I have a frame around me, and that came from Zoom. Now, my question to Zoom and to all of our corporate sponsors during Pride is, what are you doing the rest of the year? What are you doing for those students, for those people who can't find the bathrooms? What are you doing for our brothers and sisters who are in the streets and being beaten and killed and seeing these numbers go up? What is AT&T doing? What is Budweiser doing? What are all these sponsors doing? You can put your flags out there, but are you doing anything? Are you sponsoring any programs? Are you working with youth in the streets? Are you providing support for your employees? Do we know that if folks are getting appropriate health care for their trans employees, any of these things, we need to start taking a stand. And I am so happy to be in the state of New York that provides so much for so many, but we still live in a world where, and in a country where that's not true everywhere. And we see it when we see our students coming from all over the country and struggling and really looking for those ways, whether it's a bathroom or healthcare or a place to live, or sometimes even to eat, or to feeling that rejection from their families. And we need to make sure that we're providing and also using companies and corporations that are providing as well. We can't just take their money when it's June and they want to put a rainbow on their logo. We need to make sure that they're doing it every day of the year.
I want to go back to something, Michael, you said, and I don't know, Elizabeth or Joe, for getting people are allowed to ask questions. I'd love to hear from the audience. But you mentioned the word protest, and I think about that. And when you think about the word, it's a disapproval of a response or an accusation. And I would venture to say, as a president, how I own protest. And what would that mean in terms of bringing an education institution into the conversation? I am worried about how the power of our vocabulary is being hijacked over and over again, and how we're trying to, when we educate people, vocabulary in my mind is a manifestation of what we know and how we think. And the more we limit the use of terms or have them hijacked, I think the more limiting we get. So what's the big word out there now is cancel culture. And I think we have to figure out, well, what are they saying? What do they mean by that? Because the pushback on that, I think, is something that we have to look as a learned community. What is the most powerful tool we presidents have besides our own way we operate and how we put ourselves forward, is the tool of education. How do we handle when we have students? I have to tell you, every time I say something, I had a student, I was talking about Juneteenth, who said to me, "Stop it. All you are is about power and not about education." And I have to sit back and I think, whoa, wait a minute. That's exactly what I was trying to talk about, is not about power. And what does that mean these days? So I want to take on the notion of how I, as a president, can be a protest culture in the meaning how that sits in education. And how do I work with students too, who are my students, who don't like what I say? who don't believe in what I'm trying to do. I think we have to look at that as presidents in an education institution, what that entails. So I just want to put that out.
Yeah, Marion, I think that's so critical. How do we develop spaces on our campus where folks can have deliberate conversations or dialogues about things about which they fundamentally disagree? And we've been working on that on my campus because we know, for example, Potsdam is not that unlike your region. We've got 4 wonderful educational institutions in a very rural, very conservative part of the state. And so we have to think about how do we, as we bring students onto our campuses, how do we help them have some of those productive dialogues so that when they leave our campuses, they are much more able to understand somebody who has a different perspective, affirm, even if you don't agree with that person, understand and affirm their basic right to a perspective, to an identity. And we've been working very hard on that through this really innovative pilot. But I think that's what's really critical for our campuses, that we ensure when students come, that we're providing spaces for students to explore their identities, to affirm their identities, to have conversations with each other across those lines of difference. Because if we aren't facilitating that, we are not, I would argue, helping our students become the kind of educated citizens that they need to become. And so on my campus, as best I can tell, we're about 20%, depends on how you measure it, about 20% of our student body identifies as LGBTQ in some way or another. As best I can tell, we're about 2% trans. So this means we've got to try and find ways so that our LGBTQ students are visible and empowered to have, empowered to take up a little space on our campus and are recognized as an important member of our community.
So presidents, we actually had a question that came in that I think can build on that. It's from somebody, anonymous question, who is in a different state, in a different type of community, who wanted to know what specifically they could do on their campus to engage leadership and make some changes and make students feel differently perhaps than those students feel on their campus right now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think there's lots. I mean, I'll start with a couple of things. One of the things that we've been working on my campus is a project working with an organization called CELIA, and it's a deliberative dialogue project where we bring students across identities, varying identities, ethnic groups, gender, region, and they go through a deliberative dialogue process so that early data show that they are more empathetic towards others. They are more likely to have a conversation or an interaction with somebody who's different from themselves. So I think one of the things campus leaders could do is to try and create spaces like the deliberative dialogue, which we're doing as part of our incoming first-year student orientation. But then there's also some basic policy, preferred chosen name policies. Those are absolutely critical. Trying to create safe spaces. There's so much from a policy perspective and from a program perspective that campus leaders can do. And I'm going to argue campus leaders, presidents, vice presidents, deans, we should be taking the lead on this so that students don't have to take the lead. So I know that my colleagues are also doing some cool things, so would love to create space for them to talk about what they're doing as well.
So we've also been working through dialogue projects, Kristin, and I think you can't really overstate how powerful that can be, because you can get at some of the critical issues. You know, when students disagree, you can help them pull it apart. And you know, it's fine to disagree whether pineapple belongs on a pizza. It's not fine to disagree about whether someone's a human being, but it takes a conversation to get there. So I agree with you. I think those are really powerful experiences for students, and for many students, the first time they've been engaged in a conversation like that.
You know, it's important to remember that New York State schools are among the most segregated in the United States. And so when students come to our campuses, they are coming from some of the most segregated schools. And so they don't have that practice or the tools in their toolkit to try and understand what's it like to be someone who didn't grow up in my community, who doesn't look like me, who doesn't speak like me, who doesn't have the same habits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's really important that we recognize that and then really deliberatively create opportunities and tools, because we don't always have that tool in our toolkit to really create those kinds of understandings across lines of difference.
And I think you find that some of the students that jump in so quickly to those conversations are also looking for their identity, right? So it's a time in life when people are trying to crystallize who they are. And so just as our trans students are working on that, so are our cisgendered students. So finding a way to have those productive interactions, I think, is really important.
I agree.
Going back to the question of what can be done, some of the most powerful changes on college campuses have come from students. And if your students are not saying to your administrators, we need change, then you have a problem. You have a bigger problem. And so whoever wrote the question, if you're not a student, get your students involved and asking questions, whether it's policy, whether it's going to be changing your IDs so that you can reflect your gender identity or your class roster. Students have to be involved. It's important that they help drive the changes that are in institutions. Some leaders will think like, well, if we don't please the students, we'll lose money. There are those people. There are also people who believe that it's the right thing to do. And if students are asking for it, we should be responding. We have to listen. So as leaders, we all, and I know my colleagues agree with this, that if a student's saying something, we listen. We may not be able to always respond to it in the way that the student wants. I mean, there are other rules and issues that we have to deal with, but we do listen. And whether it's through our vice presidents or through folks on our campus, our role is to listen. And your leadership on your campus needs to know that students have a voice and that they are willing to use that voice and really need to get people to hear what they have to say.
Michael, if I could pick up on that for a second, I feel in the past several years, our traditional, so-called traditional aged student has become more, I'll just say like an advocacy point of view, right? Like they're expressing themselves with what I would call a more advocacy mindset, right? And we know that when you crash up against a 500-year-old higher education bureaucracy, those things don't usually mesh very well. And this could cause even more tension and conflict. And we don't listen in higher education to anything that students are saying. So in reflecting on the question and my colleagues' fine reactions to it, what I'm landing on is, when I've been in those conversations, I guess what I've been doing is just like listening for, like, where is that workable space somewhere between advocacy and bureaucracy, and then saying, all right, here's students, here's what you can hold me accountable to. Here's the piece you can hold me accountable to, and check back with me in a month or a week or 2 months or whatever the time frame is, but here's what you can hold me accountable to, and share the power, right? And just say, here's what I can do in this dance space. And so I hope that helps with the question about how to engage.
Yeah. Just to add to that, because I'm also thinking about those leaders who are not open. You know, you're talking to 5 of us who get it. A couple of things I would suggest is, believe it or not, I look at policy statements all the time, and I know my lawyer friends would agree with me. Your value statements, somewhere in your institution, there is something about how we will take care of each other. And if nothing else, you hold that up to say, okay, but here it is. So what are the structures that are allowing for this to happen? I've done this several times, use the own statements to get to that point. I think that's where you find the power of that. And if it is, but let's talk about power, because the power dynamic to say to students, it's difficult. How do you push against particularly those leaders who don't want to hear from you? So where do you find the ally? What I've done, and I've asked my vice presidents to do it all the way through the faculty. If there is a faculty person or a student or anybody in my community who is a strong advocate, particularly in where I feel uncomfortable, I say to them, keep up your good advocacy. My comfort level doesn't matter. I'll even bring students in and say, this is how you advocate against me. And they look at me, what are you talking about? I said, you need to understand the power dynamic. How you help folks understand the power dynamic is critical. Where it is safe for advocacy, where it is safe for leadership, where it is safe for management, and understand the difference among these are very powerful roles. Advocacy and management are not the same. Leadership and advocacy are different kinds of dynamic. And if somebody on the campus can say, this is how you advocate, here are your tools. Somebody has to do that, whether it's an orientation, somewhere along the line. I also think that many national organizations have to train presidents better. I think every president should go to a president's school, because if you think you are good at what you do, then you have a problem. I question my leadership and what I do every day. But how do you handle when you have leaders who don't want to hear? Go to policy, go look at Student Bill of Rights, go look, because you will find an avenue. There's always an avenue.
You know, that's important, Marion. We use our Potsdam pledge in just those ways, because we affirm that we are, a community that's watchful for intolerance and forms of bias. I also think, when I think about who supports students most, I also think if we're supporting faculty, if we're supporting residence life directors, if we're supporting those who work directly with students, that actually has greater impact, because it's faculty who are with the students in the classroom every day. So are we providing opportunities for faculty members to learn? Are we affirming our LGBTQ faculty members' openness and their ability? Are we ensuring that in our residence halls, in our student life programming, in all of the places, in our counseling, for example, our health services, that we are working with folks to ensure that they can do what they need to do in an affirming way? And that, I think, will have some of the greatest impacts on students when we ensure that not just at the leadership level, but at all levels, we're ensuring that we're empowering our campus community to serve students in the way that students should be served.
One other question that came in, and we remind folks to please don't hesitate to send questions directly to Elizabeth Brady or to me, Joseph Storch. We will anonymize them and ask them to our presidential co-chairs. Is the additional effect of a global pandemic, and pandemics are not distributed equally. And maybe I'll ask President Esterberg just to start off, because we've had a chat about students who could not go home, right? So in March, we at the State University of New York said to the vast majority of our students, as the vast majority of colleges did nationwide, that we had to close for a, God willing, once in our lifetime global pandemic. And some students, students of color, trans students, and others said, well, I don't have a comfortable home to go back to. The additional harms, illness, death, the amount of folks from lower socioeconomic status who didn't have a choice not to go back to work, who didn't have a choice not to ride public transit in New York, and the additional significant impact that that's had on our LGBTQIA+ community. Maybe starting with President Esterberg, who could talk a little bit about that experience in the spring and what folks did at Potsdam to accommodate, and then going through all of our presidents, COVID, the additional impacts, and then also, if you can, how we come out of it in a way that helps our LGBTQIA+ students succeed and thrive.
Oh, thank you for raising that. And I'll say on my campus, we serve a very low income population. About half of our students are Pell eligible, and we serve a very significant number of students for whom, when the pandemic hit, going home was very challenging. Many of our students come from New York City, probably about a quarter of them. And so when the pandemic first hit and we knew we needed to pivot to remote, we also struggled because we knew that some students didn't have a permanent home to go to. We serve students for whom Potsdam is the very best and safest, and in some cases, the only home they have. We serve for many LGBTQ students. It was really challenging for them to think about going home where they could not be open about their identities. So I will say last spring, it was really, when the pandemic first hit, it was a real challenge for our campus to try and understand how many we could serve on campus. And that was a difficult balance. I'm still, as I think back on what we know now, I wished we'd had more students on campus because I think we could have served them better. But we still had about somewhere between 80 and 100 students on our campus at any given time during the early days of the pandemic. You know, one of the interesting things I've heard from some of our trans and non-binary students was that with masking, this was the first time that some of them felt a little safer out in the community because they were able to wear a mask and they received fewer comments misgendering them. So I think there's some really interesting challenges here, and I'm not exactly sure what to make of it. But I do know that for our students, because we do serve so many low-income students, they were very deeply affected by the pandemic. Many of them lost family members. They lost, family members lost employment. It's been very, very challenging for our low-income students especially, and for our LGBTQ students who did not have a safe place to go to. On the other hand, I've heard other students say that it's been a little bit freeing for them not to have to be in public, to be able to mask. So as we exit this pandemic, I think it's going to be really complicated for campuses as we try and understand how do we support students who are coming back, who've had a very, very difficult year and a half. How do we ensure that our most vulnerable students have the resources they need to succeed? And then how do we ensure that we are really paying close attention to students' mental health concerns as well as their economic concerns? Because that, I think, has taken an enormous toll on so many of our students. I'll pass the baton off to one of my colleagues here.
I'll go, because what we realized is that the current structures of how higher education is set up abysmally failed our students. You talk about structures across the country that have not worked well. I think that is true of higher education, particularly how we would view the students. A couple things that we did, and by the way, I saw in the chat the importance of staff. Absolutely. I was a VP for campus life for 6 years, and the importance that the staff plays in understanding our students and making them feel part of a community is more than important. So shout out back to the staff. We did a couple things for our students and piggybacked off of what Kristin said, but we have a working farm. So the students that wanted to stay with us, we tried to make sure that they were a part of the enterprise, not just sheltering them. So we had jobs, and believe it or not, our animals became very important therapy entities for a lot of my community, which was really interesting. So we made sure that the students became part of the enterprise while with us, and some felt more safe to be with us than to go home, whether their family members had COVID or the situation was very precarious. So we try to build it in a way that you weren't poor things. Okay, we try to say, this is who you are, let's learn together. So a couple other things we did was we asked the students to develop the plan with us. We had a COVID plan that was sent to SUNY, but we also said to students, this is what do you need for it to take that we can ease up the restrictions? So we had 3 phases. And do you know, we were one of the campuses that had over 50% of our classes were in person, and our COVID numbers were not high. And giving the power to the students to figure out how to be a community member together with us worked unbelievably well. So they got us to phase 3. It's the other thing we did for those who didn't do well online, because we are a very place-based institution. We identified staff to call the students and say, okay, not the best semester, come back on our dime. We'll pay you to come back, take those courses over, and set up a whole new way of you succeeding. Several took us up on that call, because what we said to our students, this isn't your fault. You didn't fail. We all failed in this because we're trying to figure out what higher ed needs to do and be. It is also time, when Joe, you said, what has to happen post-COVID? Good God, we've got to get rid of these crazy structures. I am tired of the barriers. I am sick and tired that when people say, well, we can't. So I'm working on some interesting proposals that follow Job Corps and others, where students are going to come back, work, and get credit, but the work is going to be with partners that the college has chosen, because we've got to change the barriers, whether it's for BIPOC students, LGBTQ, I don't care. The disenfranchised is growing bigger and bigger. And if higher ed doesn't get rid of the barriers and our elitist attitude, shame on us. So nothing else for COVID for me is this institution is going to look very different than when we were pre-COVID. And SUNY, I'm going to warn you now, I'm coming with a bunch of policy changes that must start immediately. So I'm turning it back to you guys to say, help us get rid of the barriers that are so blatantly clear to us. Thank you.
I don't know if I could follow on that one. So that was great, Marion, and I fully support all of the things you're doing and agree. We've been looking at a number of policies and things that can be done more easily. How do we get rid of those? And if you want to hear what I always believe is the worst thing you can ever say to me is, because that's the way we've always done it. That will really, if you want to see change, use that terminology and it will change very quickly. I want to give a shout out to a couple of people, Laura and Paul, who are chatting from Student Affairs. My background is all in Student Affairs. I fully support and understand the work that Student Affairs done. And there was when we mentioned faculty and students, we certainly did not want to leave out the staff and Student Affairs. Such an incredibly important role that you play on campus. Talking about post-COVID, I think we really, and Kristin touched on this, was the mental health issues. We really don't know what we are going to get. I believe there's going to be a lot of post-traumatic stress issues on our campus. I believe there's going to be a lot of mourning that we have to do for things that we've all lost during COVID. There's also going to be a big push for students and faculty and staff to want to socialize again. People haven't been in the same room. And for anybody who is just re-entering the world, I had a meeting with the leadership team and folks wanted to chat for like the first hour, and we needed to just be able to do that and get used to being in the room. So you can expect that students especially are going to be missing that social aspect, and how can we create those opportunities for them so that we can get back to our mission of learning and being together, but make it easier. Hopefully that doesn't create a barrier for folks. And I also think that we're going to really need to commemorate what we've done. There's an opportunity for us either to celebrate or acknowledge the changes that have taken place. If all things are going well, higher education will look very different a year from now. And how are we going to adapt to that and prepare people who are looking to, I keep on hearing, we're going to go back to the way it was. We're going to go back to normal. Well, there's a new normal. I know people are tired of hearing that, but but it's true. We're not going back. The other thing is, there was a great article last week about the other freshmen coming to your campus. So there are students who have been part of your campus for almost 2 years who really haven't spent a lot of time on your campus. They have not been in classrooms. They have not been working with faculty directly. They have not gone to the dining halls. They have not hung out together. And so we're going to have students who are coming from high school who have missed that opportunity for a couple of years, and students who've been in the workforce or elsewhere who are coming to campus. It's going to be a big shakeup for our campuses, and we need to be prepared to address those issues with folks and be able to provide opportunities for this next phase of higher education. And I believe that it's a great time for us. It's going to be a wonderful time for us to think differently. It's not going to be easy. Just because we're beyond the pandemic or getting beyond the pandemic does not mean that everything's going back and we're going to have it easy again. It's not easy, and it's going to be a lot of work in the future. But I know my colleagues here are prepared for that and ready to make that move towards this next normal.
I think the thing that I worry about with that is, we've had a lot of things really laid bare in the last 18 months. We've had all the inequity that we knew was there, but we could have the luxury of not looking at it maybe on a daily basis, but it's right there right now. And I think at the same time, in the political world, we've had all of the hate that we knew was there, but now it's in our face. So I think it's a really challenging time, and I'm with you, Marion. Let's get some battering rams and go after the barriers that students face, keeping in mind, I think, all that we've seen over the last 18 months that we knew was there, but now it's right in our face.
And to round out, my shtick is always to try to go last. If your last name's been Young for all these decades, you just build that up over time. But my colleagues are brilliant. So Orange, again, in case you didn't catch it up front, is a community college, and we are one of the last community colleges in New York. It has no residence halls whatsoever, so all of our students are commuters by definition. So that, I can't say it was the first thing that occurred to me in March 2020, but it did catch up with me that our LGBTQI plus students just went into their homes in this situation and didn't even have this college for whatever it meant to them in this time. So what the resources we had in place for any student, and I can't comment on if it was used disproportionately by this group of students. We were fortunate to have a robust emergency aid fund, a couple different sources through time that we built up for housing, for food, for any sort of needs outside of tuition and books, the typical things, until the federal aid started coming through. We are a campus, we're only 60 miles from Manhattan. I think that might have been mentioned up front. So we remained largely off campus, if you will, remote throughout the 2021 academic year. But you know what? Our SAGA student club, SAGA stands for Sexuality and Gender Alliance, turned out to be one of the most active student clubs through a remote stance by the end of the year. So they found fellowship and support in a remote stance and organized a really beautiful and touching lavender graduation at the end of the year. So they self-organized and with great club leadership from faculty, from advisors at the end of that. So that stayed with me as I here today and lessons learned, and commenting on what comes next. Language I'm using here is, this is a transition year. So yeah, next normal. I have no idea where we're landing. We're not going to know for years. Let's be honest. Let's be honest about this. But this is a transition year, and those stressors and tensions that have been identified, they're going to wrestle with each other, and they're going to wrestle differently on each one of our campuses because it's local. All politics is local, all campuses are local. So how this manifests, every one of us, no matter what your role is at your college, pay attention to student needs, and respond with your heart and your professionalism and your know-how. Our students are going to need us in ways that I don't think we can yet articulate. So we are just going to have to be flexible.
I just want to piggyback, Kris, you're so right, and thank you. And I also think it's important that I call it the new reality. I don't want to go back to normal. I think if it's the normal, then all of the structures that were in place, I think they're just going to come back. I also think when you say transition, it's time, if you haven't, as leaders, to have the difficult conversations for the First Amendment. And what it means as a higher education institution to sit in the First Amendment. And I want to start pushing back to say it's also our obligation to extend, as I said earlier, our vocabulary, our understanding, and our critical thinking. I am very scared how First Amendment has gotten hijacked again by people who really are out to destroy it. And the whole thing with academic freedom, how that sits, excuse my language, it's been bastardized to the point that we're going to lose out. It's more important now to be more bold and to push it forward and to start asking people. So what I've started to do is when people say crazy things, I say to them, what do you mean by that? So just the other day, all those liberals, I said, what do you mean? What's the matter? Can you tell me what the matter is with those liberals? Is it because we take care of people, or, what is the issue? Because people have been allowed to say things without accountability and not to be afraid of it. So the new reality is start asking them what the heck they mean by that. Because I guarantee you, most of the time, they're just parroting and mimicking others. And if we as educating leaders allow that, shame on us.
Another great question that came in from one of our attendees builds on something that the Chancellor said in introducing each of you, which is going beyond the campus environment and providing programming to local and far-reaching communities. The person writes that recent pushback to many policy institutions to many policy changes at the public institutions they work have primarily been from community members and state officials rather than from students or faculty. Any advice for what this may look like? And we're gonna switch things up. As a fellow denizen of the last half of the alphabet, we will start with President Young. So going beyond students and beyond the campus to engaging local and state leaders.
Darn it, I always have so much. I once did an algebra calculation of how much, time I lost on, mathematics tests throughout my K through 12 career, getting dealt the test last, Joe. All right. So, one thing I've learned in this job is it's obvious to all of you. I know it, but because everybody went to school, right? At least got to the 10th grade or something. Everybody's got an opinion about how education works, and it is deeply held and deeply vested. So when working with people in the community, including elected officials, they think they know how your college works. So the just having the patience and confidence and decorum to talk about what it really is, and remembering how many different types of colleges and universities are represented here with over 500 people watching in these spaces, right? Not one of them is alike, even in the same sectors. So needing to talk about who our students really are, what is actually the mission of the institution we're in, how the darn thing is actually funded, and why this thing can't happen for the student, or oh my gosh, just having to talk about it and talk about it with passion, and then talk about it again and talk about it again and talk about it again with the same person. And depending on what your state or your locality is like, perhaps having to do that 21 times in the same week. You might have to do that. So it's just that sort of perseverance our community members and our elected officials are not bad people. But I'll have to remind myself they are also hearing this about bridges and taxes and environmental concerns and Social Security. And I'm just talking about one community college. So just having to be passionate and memorable about the concerns. It sounds so, I know it sounds a little naive, but that's the way I got to go at it, especially since you called on me first, Joe.
You want to keep going down the alphabet then? So I guess I follow you, huh, Kris? When I came to Cobleskill, there were cars driving around the village. We're the largest employer, with logo that said LAC, Local Against College Kids. So I had a lot of work to do. And we did a couple things. First of all, I started a coalition immediately with the chief of police, my chief of police, the mayor, the board trustees, prominent leaders, and I brought everybody together, and they're still meeting monthly to figure out what is going on. And the other thing I did too was when I met with the leaders, I said, okay, what are we doing that's so bad? But I also want to tell you that you need to stop treating my students like pariah. You need to also make sure that your housing, because I will call the code enforcer on you, is up to, because my students were living in cold water flats and they thought that was okay, paying for it. So you had to be bold with that because you trust your students. You know who they are. The other thing I did, I made every vice president join a board, a community board. Who's on the chamber, who's on the community development board, I'm on the hospital board. I said, get out there and get on boards immediately. The other thing we've done is I meet with the mayor regularly. I invite her to every event and she opens my events. And then we just started, we're working with Everfi to build what we call an inclusive champion medal, that we are building a micro-credential, I guess you can call it, for leaders in the community, church leaders, business leaders, if they can get trained in understanding all issues, LGBTQ, Black, Brown, BIPOC issues, they will also then get a medallion that will put in their homes and their businesses to say to my students, I am a safe place for you. If you're having issues or would like to come in, if they see the Inclusive Champion medallion, they will come in. And that just actually got funded by a private entity. I had to take matters into my hands, probably more than others, because my students were in jeopardy. They were in harm's way. So there's many things you have to do. And I agree with you, Kris. It's also showing the love and compassion. And because we're the largest employer and our students weren't here in full force over the pandemic, all the businesses realized how much money they lost. And I had said to them, my students give you $250,000 a semester. For a small village of 5,000 people, $250,000 a semester is a lot of money. So you've got to show them the way, as Kris said. I agree.
We're still going opposite alphabet, I guess. Agreeing with what Marion had said about really engaging the local folks. And one of the things that we've done on our campus is bring them to our campus and have them meet our students. I mean, one of the things that people often have these myths about students. All students are this, all students are that, and engaging them with our students and having them, whether they're politicians or board members. We have a lot of space on our campus, and typically in our town, you need a meeting space, and that's certainly something we can provide. But with that, they'll need to honestly hear from me and hear from others about who our students are, what they're doing, what's happening. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to folks who are elected officials representing our area who had no idea the type of programs we offer, where our students come from, how they are represented there, and really instilling in that. And Kris, you're right when you say you have to repeat it 1,000 times. It's not changed a whole lot of what I say, but the audience has changed. But I keep on saying the same things over and over again. Oh, You have those programs. Oh, students are coming from there. Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. And I really think it's important that we do that. And then also to be brave enough to have those conversations about issues that are going on in town, whether it was our students in our predominantly white community, our students of color, how they felt about going into some of the shops and restaurants, or our LGBT students who wanted to have a pride event and how to engage people around those issues. I mean, those are the types of things that you've got to be I think it's a brave that you're just going to say, we're going to do this. I need to engage you, and how we're going to engage the local community with those issues with our students. Our students are here. You're right. They're spending money. They're renting properties. They're providing also some work to the local folks, and they are part of the community. They're not just visitors. They are real people who are here, and we need to provide local people with the sense that they are real and they are here and important.
You know, I'll build on that. I think it's also important to remember that our staff and faculty are part and parcel of the community. And so when we think about the impact that our campuses have on our regions, it's more than our students. I will share with you, I feel very lucky in that the mayor of our village used to work for our SUNY Potsdam. And so we've been able to develop a great relationship over time. And I think you build on those. What I want to go in a slightly different direction is that those of us who have K-12 teacher preparation programs, I think have a special opportunity to work with our communities. We've, you know, as one of the largest preparers of teachers in our region, in just about every school, we have alumni. We have alumni in our principals and our superintendents roles. And that can be such an important place to create islands of islands where there's greater acceptance of our students, greater acceptance of LGBTQ students. So for us, we've really tried to think about how do we make sure that when teachers leave our campus, they are well prepared to be ambassadors. And that when we're sending students as student teachers into the community, that's an opportunity to have an educational moment with their supervising teachers. We've been very fortunate that in some of the communities around here, principals and superintendents have asked for us to come and do workshops on how to create safe spaces for LGBTQ students. So there's a lot that those of us who prepare teachers can and should do, and have the opportunity to do that are really, I think, transformative for our communities.
So batting clean up from the letter C.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that this may be an area where community colleges have a slightly easier road. We, like Kris, I talk a lot of time with our elected officials about what the college offers, but also about the fact that about 85% of our students will live in a 25-mile radius their whole life. And so when you talk about building the future of Central New York, you better be talking about my students, or you're missing really where the engine is. And getting those students out and getting them into the schools, getting them into the businesses, and really making evident the connection between those powerful individuals and our institution.
As we wrap up, we want to say thank you for another incredible conversation. Having gone to SUNY myself 20-ish years ago, the idea back then that we would have a single president in the system who was out and openly so and led from that was unimaginable. And now to be able to work with all of you and your fellow presidents and leadership, to have a chancellor who actively goes to the Pride March and was eager to join us for SUNY Spectrum. There wasn't a question in anyone's mind. It was which of the sessions would he be participating in, is just a real exceptional thing. Thank you to Chancellor Malatras, to Presidents Terenzio and Esterberg and Crabill and Young and Laliberte. A special warm wishes to President Esterberg, who will be leaving for another presidential position Even though you will no longer be a SUNY president, we hope you know that you will always be warmly welcome at SUNY Spectrum, and we hope that we will see you again for many years to come. We are giving everybody a half an hour to check your email and the Twitter and grab some lunch if you're here on the East Coast, or some breakfast if you're tuning in from the West Coast, or some dinner from last night if you're tuning in from Hawaii. And be sure to be back with us at 1:30 Eastern, about 30 minutes from now. Nadia Swanson from the Ali Forney Center is going to be talking about using a harm reduction approach with LGBTQIA+ youth experience homelessness and survival sex. It's going to be an incredible program. Thank you again to our presidential co-chairs. We cannot wait to have this session again live and in person. Elizabeth and the team, thank you. And we will see you all in about 30 minutes.